Okay. So this morning I was writing about this notion of the living story. And as I said, originally it picked up the idea of it having its own place, its own time, and its own mind, and a mind of aliveness. How do you have a living story that's alive? It sounds ridiculous, but people talk of their team as if it's alive, if it has its own aliveness. And that's an interesting topic then. When we look at the notion of storytelling, what we see in the transcripts, or what I see in the transcripts I've done when I've done the work you've done over an extended period of time, is a couple of things. First, people never tell a whole story, especially in a team, because they don't have to. They speak in code. They little fragments mean a whole story. There's no real whole story anyway, but they'll say, okay, remember the market, and then everybody cues in on that indexical of the marketplace that they went to together. And so the story is always 90% or so implied. But to you, researching originally, you don't know what the hell they're talking about, because they're keying into all kinds of experiences they've had together that you weren't part of, and they're not telling you the whole thing. And so that's a key point in my 1991 article in Administrative Science Quarterly, and something that people seem to be forgetting. But let's get to the notes today. Living stories. Notice the fragments surfacing. The fragments are images, associations, impulses, attractions. Fragments are floating all about us. We have only to notice them, this fourth person that I'm talking about. The living stories are having an aliveness, and they keep composing themselves out of fragments. You know my work on anti-narrative fragments from the 2001 book. Tracing the fragments is what I do. Picks fragments out of zillions of fragments that are floating about this team and yourself. And where did it come from? A particular fragment. Where is it going? How is it relating to other fragments? Why is this fragment here now, and what's happened to it? Where is it going? Living stories have a time for the telling. Living stories have a mind all their own. How living stories are composed and fleeting fragments. And did you ever decide in your own telling of your story about the living story that you're going to tell a living story, and you kind of choked up and you couldn't tell it to your girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever, your best friend, your boss? So we have these relationships to living stories that are embodied in us, and in a team they're embodying the living story in the raw fields. Is that a series of singularities will happen. They're coexisting, and these singularities, what Deleuze calls ramified on page 51. From the series of distributions of singularities, you'll get these convergence or divergent points. And on page 51, he talks about there's no structure without an empty square. In other words, if these fragments have no place to move into, they have no empty square to converge or diverge. And he talks on page 102 about emissions of singularities. So let's look at a team as emissioning these singularities that are mobile, nomadic distributions. And he says on page 102, 103, that singularities are the true transcendent events. And he talks about the fourth person right in those 2 pages. So he's talking about something that's pre-individual, not the individual or the person, but we're talking about a team, and it's not stable. And he calls it, but it is metastable, he says. It has potential, and by that he means it has potential energy to do something. And then he quotes Alice in Wonderland on page 237. It says, well, something is going to happen, but what? Like something's going to happen with the team, but what? And this notion of the living story formation, is in this transcendental field that he talks about in the book. At least it helps me understand it. So I think the main chapter on singularities is the 15th chapter in the book, called the 15th series of singularities, and talks about things like volitional intuition as opposed to empirical intuition. And that's where I was kind of stopping my notes this morning when it was time to talk to you. And so I'm going to end the recording there, and then I'll send it to you. I'll post it for you, okay?